My name is Andrew, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. Truthfully, I wish I didn't have to. But after what happened to me, I know it's not something I can keep to myself. If you're here, you felt it too. That sense that the world isn't what it seems, that something bigger is happening just out of view. I felt that way too, though I never knew how to put it into words. Then, on a rainy night not so long ago, my life changed forever. It had been a long day, one of those stretches where the hours blur together into a grind. Work had been relentless, and all I wanted was to get home, collapse on the couch, and see my kids' faces light up when I walked through the door. The rain had started while I was in the office, a steady drizzle that turned heavier as the evening wore on. By the time I left, the streets shimmered under the glow of the streetlights, slick and reflective like mirrors. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. My tires didn't have much life left in them, and every turn felt like a gamble. The rhythmic patter of rain on the windshield was almost hypnotic, but I kept telling myself, just a few more miles. The thought of my family waiting for me was enough to keep me focused, or at least I thought it was. The last thing I remember is a sudden flash of headlights cutting across my vision. It wasn't even from the road I was on. It came from the side, like some kind of apparition. My heart leapt into my throat as I heard the unmistakable screech of brakes. Then came the jolt. It wasn't just a feeling. It was an explosion of sound and motion, metal twisting and glass shattering. And then, nothing. Nothing is the only way I can describe it. It wasn't dark or light. It wasn't hot or cold. It was just absence. For a moment I thought I'd fallen unconscious, that I'd wake up any second to the smell of airbags and the sound of sirens. But the longer I stayed in that nothingness, the more I realized something was different. I wasn't in my body anymore. I don't know how I knew, but I just did. I felt a pull, gentle but insistent, like a current in a river. My first instinct was to fight it, to cling to the life I knew I'd left behind. My kids' faces flashed in my mind, their laughter echoing faintly, and I thought, I can't leave them, not yet. But the pull didn't stop. It wasn't something I could resist, even if I wanted to. When the light appeared, it wasn't blinding or harsh. It was warm, welcoming, like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, drawing me toward it with a peace I can't explain. I don't know how long I drifted, but eventually I found myself standing, or maybe floating, in a place that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The air was thick with something I can only describe as presence. It wasn't heavy, but it was undeniable, like every molecule around me was alive and aware. I looked down at myself and saw nothing. Not my hands, not my feet, not even a shadow. And yet I felt more real than I ever had before. Then I heard it, a voice. It wasn't loud or commanding, but it carried a weight that stopped me in my tracks. Andrew, it said, and the sound of my name sent a tremor through my entire being. I didn't need to ask who it was. I knew. Deep down, in a place beyond logic or reason, I knew exactly who was speaking to me. You're not alone, he said, his voice a mixture of love and sorrow. I tried to speak, to ask where I was or what was happening, but no words came. It didn't matter, though, because he already knew. What happened next was unlike anything I could have imagined. The light around me began to shift, forming shapes and colors that moved like living paintings. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then it hit me. These weren't just images. They were memories. My memories. I saw my entire life play out before me, not like a movie, but as if I were reliving each moment all at once. I saw the time I skipped school to hang out with friends, the look on my mother's face when she found out. I felt her disappointment all over again, but this time, I also felt the love behind it, the love I hadn't understood back then. I saw the day I got married, the joy and the nervousness swirling together as I promised my life to someone else. I felt the weight of that promise in a way I never had before, realizing how much it had shaped me. And then I saw the things I wanted to forget. The lies I'd told, The times I'd hurt people without meaning to, the moments when I could have done the right thing but chose not to. Each one hit me like a wave, but instead of drowning me, they washed over me with a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't being judged, not yet anyway. It was more like understanding. As the last memory faded, the voice spoke again, softer this time. "Do you see now?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. What was I supposed to see? My life was full of mistakes and regrets, sure, but wasn't that just part of being human? Before I could even form the thought, the scene around me changed, and what I saw next would haunt me forever. The light that had surrounded me dimmed, giving way to something darker, colder. I was no longer floating in warmth and peace. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me with a suffocating weight. At first I thought I was back in the accident, trapped in the wreckage, but then I realized this was something else. Something far worse. I stood, or maybe hovered on the edge of a vast expanse. The ground beneath me was cracked and dry as if it had been scorched by endless heat. Beyond, a churning darkness stretched endlessly, its surface flickering with strange, fiery hues. It wasn't fire like we know it, not orange and red, but a sickly, shifting combination of black and crimson, alive in its movement. In the distance, I could see shapes moving within the darkness. At first, they seemed like shadows, formless and fleeting. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were people. Countless people, writhing and reaching, as though trapped in some kind of current they couldn't escape. Their cries were faint at first, muffled by the sheer enormity of the place, but they grew louder, rising into a chorus of anguish that seemed to pierce straight through me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were drawn to them, and as I watched, I began to see their faces. Some were faces I recognized, friends, co-workers, even strangers I'd passed on the street without a second thought. Others were faces I didn't know but somehow felt connected to, as if they were reflections of choices I'd made or failed to make. And then the voice came again, steady and unwavering. This is what happens when they choose the lie over the truth. I didn't need to ask what he meant. Somehow I already knew. The lie wasn't just about deceit or dishonesty. It was something far deeper, something woven into the very fabric of the world we live in. It was the illusion of control, the promise of convenience, the allure of power disguised as progress. My heart sank as I realized the people I was seeing weren't trapped here against their will. They had chosen this step by step, decision by decision. Each time they compromised, each time they turned away from what was right and good, they had taken one more step into the darkness. But they didn't know, I said, my voice trembling. They didn't understand what they were doing. The silence that followed was deafening. When he spoke again, his words cut through me like a blade. They knew enough. The truth was always there, waiting for them to see it. But the lie was easier. I wanted to argue, to defend them, or maybe to defend myself. After all, how many times had I chosen the easier path? How many times had I ignored the quiet voice in my heart telling me to do better, to be better? The scene shifted again, and this time I was no longer on the edge of the darkness. I was in it. The air was thick and oppressive, and every breath felt like a struggle. Around me, the shadows moved, their faces flickering in and out of view. Some of them reached for me, their hands grasping at nothing, their mouths forming words I couldn't hear. Others simply stared, their eyes empty and hollow. I turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was everywhere, pressing in on all sides. Panic rose in my chest, and for the first time since I'd left my body, I felt truly afraid. "Help me," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was asking. In that moment, a single beam of light pierced the darkness. It wasn't bright or overpowering, but it was steady, unwavering. I turned toward it instinctively, drawn to its warmth like a lifeline. As I stepped into the light, the shadows fell away, their cries fading into the distance. The warmth returned, wrapping around me like a shield, and I felt a presence beside me. "You were never alone," he said, his voice gentle now, full of understanding. I turned to face him, and for the first time I saw him clearly. His eyes were unlike anything I'd ever seen, vast and deep, filled with a love so profound it was almost unbearable. But there was sorrow there too, a sorrow that felt as though it encompassed all of creation. "What happens to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The ones in the darkness, they can still be saved," he said, "but only if they choose to be." A weight settled over me as I realized the enormity of what he was saying. The darkness wasn't final, but the choice to leave it had to be their own. No one could force them, not even him. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "What can I do?" His gaze met mine, and for a moment I felt as though he was looking straight into my soul. "You must tell them," he said simply. "Warn them of what is coming. Show them the truth before it's too late." Before I could respond, the light around me began to fade and the warmth started to slip away. Panic surged through me again as I realized I was being pulled back to the world I had left behind. "No, wait," I cried, reaching out to him. "I'm not ready," but it was too late. The light disappeared and I was plunged into darkness once more. This time, though, it wasn't the oppressive void I had seen before. It was something different, something I would come to understand only after I woke up. The first thing I became aware of was the sound of beeping, steady, rhythmic, relentless. It was distant at first, like it was coming from the far end of a tunnel, but it grew louder, sharper, until it seemed to echo in my skull. Then came the pain. It was everywhere, radiating out from my chest and spreading through my limbs like fire. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but I forced them open, desperate to orient myself, to understand what had just happened. Blinding fluorescent lights greeted me, and I squinted against their harshness, my throat dry and raw. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nose, and the faint hum of machines surrounded me. As my vision cleared, I saw faces, familiar, tear-streaked faces. My wife was there, her hand gripping mine so tightly it was as if she thought I might slip away again if she let go. My kids stood behind her, their wide eyes filled with fear and relief in equal measure. "Dad," my daughter whispered, her voice trembling. Are you okay?" I tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse croak. My wife shushed me gently, tears spilling down her cheeks as she stroked my forehead. "Don't try to talk," she said. "You're okay, you're here, you're alive, alive." The word hit me like a blow. I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I was back. The memory of the crash came rushing back in vivid detail. The flash of headlights, the screech of brakes, the moment my body had been thrown into chaos. And then the light, the voice, the vision. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might be dying all over again. But it wasn't pain or fear that gripped me. It was the weight of what I had seen, what I now knew. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to come back. The doctors came in after what felt like hours, their faces a mixture of astonishment and clinical detachment. They explained the extent of my injuries, a shattered leg, several broken ribs, and a heart that had stopped beating for over 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's how long I'd been gone. But what I had experienced in those 4 minutes felt like an eternity. They called it a miracle, my survival. "You're lucky," one of them said, shaking his head as he reviewed my charts. "Most people wouldn't have made it. Lucky. That word didn't feel right. Lucky was winning the lottery or finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. This wasn't luck. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't explain even to myself." The days that followed were a blur of recovery, endless tests, physical therapy, and quiet moments in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling as I replayed the experience over and over in my mind. I tried to push it aside, to tell myself it was just a dream or a hallucination brought on by the trauma. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the people in the darkness, reaching, crying out. I heard their voices, faint and desperate, and I felt the pull of the light, the warmth of his presence. His words echoed in my mind. "You must tell them, warn them of what is coming." But how? How could I possibly tell anyone what I had seen? Who would believe me? I could already hear the dismissive responses. It was just a dream. You were hallucinating. Your brain was starved of oxygen, that's all it was. I barely believed it myself, and yet deep down I knew it was true. The truth of it was woven into every fiber of my being now, undeniable and unshakable. One night after my family had gone home and the hospital was quiet, I sat up in bed, staring out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The weight of what I had seen pressed down on me like a physical force, and I found myself speaking aloud as if he could hear me. "Why me?" I whispered. "I'm nobody. I'm not strong enough for this. I don't even know where to start." The silence that followed was deafening. I had half expected some kind of answer, some sign or reassurance, but there was nothing, just the distant hum of machines and the faint murmur of voices from the hallway. Tears welled up in my eyes, and for the first time since the accident, I let myself cry. Not just for the pain I was in or the fear I felt, but for the enormity of what I now carried. It felt like a burden too heavy to bear, a mission I wasn't equipped to fulfill. But even as the tears fell, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the overwhelming warmth I had felt in his presence, but it was enough to steady me, to remind me that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I asked my wife to bring me a notebook. She looked at me curiously but didn't question it, and when she returned with it later that day, I opened it to the first page and stared at the blank lines for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I picked up the pen and wrote the only thing I could think of. "This is what I saw." The words came slowly at first, halting and unsure, but as I kept writing, they began to flow. The images, the sounds, the emotions, they all poured out of me, filling page after page until my hand ached and the sun had long since set. When I finished, I closed the notebook and held it in my lap, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't mine to keep. It belonged to the people I had seen, to the ones who still had a chance to step into the light. I didn't know how to warn them, how to make them listen, but I knew I had to try. It didn't take long for the doubts to creep in. As the days turned into weeks and I slowly regained my strength, the enormity of what I'd experienced started to feel unreal, even to me. The notebook sat on my bedside table, its pages filled with the words I'd poured out in a frenzy. I hadn't shown it to anyone yet. Every time I thought about sharing it, I was overcome by a fear I couldn't quite name. What if they laughed? What if they didn't believe me? Worse, what if they did believe me and thought I'd lost my mind? My family was thrilled that I was alive and recovering, but I could see the way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't paying attention. My wife, in particular, seemed to be waiting for something, her eyes full of unspoken questions. I couldn't blame her. I'd been distant, distracted, haunted by visions I couldn't explain. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, she finally asked the question I knew had been weighing on her. "What happened to you that night when you were gone?" Her voice was soft, careful, as if she were afraid of pushing me too hard. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the armrest of the chair. For a moment, I thought about brushing her off, about telling her it was nothing, just a dream. But the memory of his voice echoed in my mind. "You must tell them." So I told her. I started from the beginning, describing the crash, the light, the warmth, and the voice that had called to me. I told her about the darkness, the people trapped within it, and the overwhelming sorrow I'd felt as I watched them struggle. I told her about him, how his presence had filled me with both peace and a profound sense of purpose. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my wife's face. She didn't speak for a long time, and I braced myself for her reaction. "I believe you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't understand it, but I believe you." Relief washed over me, so intense it left me breathless. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words until that moment. Over the next few days, I shared the story with my kids, then with a few close friends. The reactions varied, some were supportive, others skeptical. But no one dismissed me outright, and that gave me the courage to take the next step. I decided to write everything down, not just in the notebook, but in a form that could reach more people. I didn't know exactly what that would look like, a book, an article, something online, but I knew I had to try. The vision I'd seen wasn't just for me. It was a warning, a call to action for anyone willing to listen. The more I wrote, the more I began to see connections I hadn't noticed before. The darkness I'd seen wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, tangible, and it was creeping into our world in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. It was in the endless pursuit of convenience, in the blind trust we placed in systems and technologies we barely understood. It was in the subtle compromises we made every day, choosing comfort over truth, safety over freedom. I thought about the mark I'd seen in the vision, the way it had seemed to bind people to the darkness. At first, I wasn't sure what it meant, but as I looked around at the world, I began to see it everywhere. It wasn't a physical mark, not yet, but it was there in spirit, in the choices we made and the values we abandoned. And then there were the warnings. At night, as I lay in bed, I began to feel a strange restlessness, as if the vision wasn't done with me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, images flashing through my mind, scenes of a world not far from our own, where the line between truth and deception had blurred beyond recognition. People were divided, not by borders or ideologies, but by something deeper, something invisible. Some walked in the light, their steps steady and sure, while others stumbled in the shadows, their faces filled with confusion and fear. In one of these dreams, I saw him again. He stood at the edge of the light, his arms outstretched, calling to those in the darkness. But only a few turned toward him. The rest seemed unable or unwilling to see him. When I woke, the words he'd spoken during my near-death experience echoed in my mind. The deception coming is greater than you can imagine. Even the faithful will be tested. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that the choices we made now would determine the future not just for ourselves, but for generations to come. It was overwhelming, terrifying even, but it also filled me with a strange sense of determination. I wasn't anyone special. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But I knew one thing: I had to try. I had to tell my story, no matter how hard it was, no matter how many people doubted me. Because somewhere out there, someone needed to hear it. Someone needed to know that the light was still there, waiting for them to turn toward it. And so, I kept writing, kept sharing, kept praying for the strength to do what I'd been called to do. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always clear, but it was a start. What I'd seen during those 4 minutes had changed me forever, and I knew it wasn't just a glimpse of what lay beyond. It was a glimpse of what could still be saved. The moment I decided to share my story publicly, a new kind of fear settled over me. It wasn't the fear of rejection or ridicule that I could brace for. It was the fear of responsibility, the weight of knowing that once my words were out there, I couldn't take them back. There would be no hiding, no going back to the life I had before. I spent hours staring at the screen, the blinking cursor taunting me as I tried to figure out how to begin. How do you tell the world that you died and came back with a warning from Jesus himself? How do you say it in a way that people will actually listen, that they won't dismiss as the ramblings of a man who'd been too close to death? Eventually, I stopped trying to make it perfect and just started typing. I told the story the way it had happened, raw and unpolished, just as I'd written it in the notebook. I described the crash, the light, the darkness, and the overwhelming love I'd felt in his presence. I wrote about the warning he'd given me, the vision of a world teetering on the edge, and the chilling words, "Even the faithful will be tested." When I was done, I read it over, my hands trembling. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That would have to be enough. I posted it online that night, not knowing what to expect. I wasn't sure if anyone would even see it, let alone believe it. But as the hours passed, comments began to trickle in. At first, they were few and far between, people thanking me for sharing, others asking questions. Then, slowly but surely, the post started to spread. By the next day, it had been shared hundreds of times. By the end of the week, thousands. Some people were supportive, saying they'd had similar experiences or that my story had given them hope. Others were skeptical, accusing me of making it all up for attention. I tried not to let the negativity get to me, but it was hard. For every person who reached out to say my story had inspired them, there was another who dismissed me as crazy or delusional. But even in the midst of the criticism, I kept going. Something inside me wouldn't let me stop. It wasn't just the memory of what I'd seen. It was the conviction that this message wasn't mine to keep. It didn't matter if people believed me or not. What mattered was that I tried, that I gave them the chance to hear the truth. As the days turned into weeks, I started receiving emails and messages from people all over the world. Some shared their own near-death experiences, describing encounters with the light or moments of profound clarity. Others asked for guidance, desperate to understand what they could do to prepare for the deception I'd spoken of. I didn't have all the answers, but I did my best to respond to each message, even if it was just to let them know they weren't alone. One night I received a message that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a man I didn't know, someone from a country halfway across the world. His words were simple but chilling. "I read your story. I think I understand what you mean by the mark. It's happening here already. People are being asked to give up their freedom for the promise of safety. But it doesn't feel right. It feels wrong, like something is missing. Thank you for giving me the courage to question it." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding. It was happening. The deception wasn't some far-off event. It was unfolding right now, right in front of us. The more I thought about it, the more I began to see the signs. It wasn't just about technology or politics or religion. It was about the subtle shifts in the way we lived our lives, the compromises we made without even realizing it. Every time we chose convenience over conviction, every time we turned a blind eye to injustice or accepted a lie because it was easier than facing the truth, we stepped closer to the darkness. I didn't know how to stop it. I wasn't a leader or a prophet or anyone with the power to change the world. But I knew one thing: the light was still there. It was in the love we showed to one another, in the courage it took to stand up for what was right, in the quiet moments of prayer and reflection where we turned our hearts back to Him. As the messages continued to pour in, I realized that I wasn't alone in this. There were others who felt the same pull, the same urgency to wake up and pay attention. Together, we could be the light in the darkness, even if it was just a small flicker. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The weight of the mission still scared me, but it didn't paralyze me anymore. I wasn't doing this alone. I never had been. The light I'd felt in His presence was still with me, guiding me, reminding me that even in the face of doubt and fear, there was hope. Hope for me. Hope for my family. Hope for all of us. As time passed, my life became a strange blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary. I still had bills to pay, meals to cook, and family responsibilities to manage. But running parallel to the mundane rhythms of life was this deeper, urgent calling I couldn't ignore. Every conversation, every quiet moment, every glance at the world seemed layered with a new kind of clarity. The warnings I had seen during my near-death experience weren't just abstract ideas anymore. They were visible in the world around me. It was in the slow erosion of trust between people, the way truth felt slippery and hard to grasp. It was in the relentless push toward conformity disguised as progress, the voices whispering that to resist was to be left behind. One evening, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, staring out the window at the twilight sky. The world outside seemed so peaceful, birds chirping, a light breeze rustling the trees. And yet, beneath the surface, I could feel the tension, the subtle pull towards something I couldn't fully name but knew was dangerous. My wife walked in, breaking me out of my thoughts. "You've been quiet lately," she said, placing a mug of tea in front of me. "I'm always quiet," I replied, forcing a small smile. She tilted her head, studying me in that way only she could. "No, it's different. You're carrying something," I sighed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. I can't stop thinking about it. Everything he showed me. The warnings, the darkness. It feels like it's already here, growing, spreading, and most people don't even see it." She nodded slowly, her eyes soft with understanding. "Not everyone will see it, but some will. You've already reached so many people, more than you realize. Sometimes it feels like it's not enough," I admitted. "Like no matter what I say, the world is just barreling toward the edge." Her hand rested on mine, steady and warm. "Maybe you can't stop the world, but you can light the way for the ones who are willing to see. That's all you can do. That's all he's asking you to do." Her words stayed with me long after she'd gone to bed. They reminded me of the light I'd seen during my experience, the way it had reached for those trapped in the darkness, even when they didn't reach back. It didn't force them, didn't demand anything of them. It simply waited, constant and unyielding, for them to turn toward it. The next day, I received an email that felt like an answer to my doubts. It was from a woman named Sarah, someone I'd never met, living in a small town halfway across the country. "I read your story," she wrote. "At first, I didn't want to believe it. It scared me. But something about it stayed with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Last week, I started praying for the first time in years. I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I feel different, lighter. Thank you for sharing your story. You've changed my life." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read her words. I realized then that it didn't matter if I reached thousands or just one. Each person who turned toward the light was a victory, a step away from the darkness. Over time, more people began reaching out, sharing their own experiences, their own moments of awakening. Some had dreams or visions that mirrored what I'd seen. Others simply felt a tug in their hearts, a call to return to something they'd lost or forgotten. But not everyone was receptive. The backlash was fierce in some corners. I was called a liar, a fanatic, even a danger to society. It hurt, but I tried not to let it consume me. I reminded myself of the words he had spoken. The deception coming is greater than you can imagine. If even the faithful would be tested, how could I expect anything less? There were moments, though, when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world seemed impossibly dark, I would cry out to him, asking for guidance, for reassurance that I wasn't failing. In those moments, I often felt his presence, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't always in words or visions. Sometimes it was a quiet sense of peace, a reminder that I wasn't alone. Other times, it was in the faces of my family, the laughter of my children, the love that bound us together despite everything. One night, as I prayed for strength, I felt the familiar warmth of his light surrounding me. This time, it wasn't a vision or a dream. It was something deeper, something that seemed to settle into my very soul. "You are not alone," the words came, not in a voice but in a knowing. "Keep walking in the light, keep calling them to me. The darkness cannot overcome what I have already claimed." Those words became my anchor. No matter how dark the world seemed, no matter how much resistance I faced, I held on to them. The light was stronger. It always had been. It always would be. And so I continued, step by step, day by day, sharing the truth I had been given, trusting that it would reach those who needed it most. It wasn't about saving the world. It was about being faithful to the call, about standing in the light even when the shadows pressed in. Because in the end, the light was all that mattered. And it was enough. Not long after the message of reassurance I felt in prayer, my resolve deepened, but so did the opposition. The more I spoke, the more resistance I encountered, not just from strangers online but from people I had known my whole life. Friends began to distance themselves, their once warm conversations replaced with polite but strained silences. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" One of my closest friends asked me over the phone one afternoon. You've got a family to think about. Do you really want them to grow up with everyone thinking their dad's some kind of lunatic?" His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because I could hear the fear in them. Fear for me, fear of what I might lose. "I understand why you feel that way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But this isn't about me. It's not even about what people think. It's about something much bigger. I can't turn away from it." He sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that carried both resignation and sorrow. "I just don't want to see you lose everything, man." I didn't have an answer for that, at least not one that would satisfy him. The truth was, I didn't know what the cost would be. I only knew I had to keep going no matter what. The pressure wasn't just external. There were moments when I wrestled with my own doubts, moments when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had misunderstood what I'd seen, if I had somehow twisted my own fears into a vision and mistaken it for truth. But then I would remember the way his presence had felt, the overwhelming peace and love that had filled every part of me. I would remember the light and the warnings and the clarity that had pierced through all the noise and confusion of the world. Those memories steadied me, reminded me of what was real. The turning point came one evening when I received an invitation to speak at a small community gathering. A woman named Angela had reached out to me, saying that her church group had read my story and wanted me to share it with them in person. At first, I hesitated. Writing about my experience was one thing. Speaking about it face to face, seeing people's reactions as I told them, was something else entirely. What if I froze? What if they didn't believe me? But then I thought about Sarah, the woman who had started praying again after reading my story. I thought about the man from across the world who had found the courage to question what felt wrong. And I knew I had to go. The gathering was held in a modest community center, a small room with folding chairs arranged in rows and a podium at the front. About 30 people were there, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly couples. As I stood in front of them, my heart pounding, I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them about the crash, about the moment my soul had left my body, and about the light that had drawn me in. I described the presence of Jesus, the love in his voice, and the warnings he had given me. As I spoke, I saw their faces shift. Some were wide-eyed with wonder, others somber with understanding. A few had tears streaming down their cheeks. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, one by one, they began to speak. "I felt that light before," an elderly man said, his voice trembling. "I didn't die, but I had a moment once where I knew he was with me, hearing you talk about it. It's like remembering something I'd forgotten." A young woman raised her hand. "What can we do? How do we prepare for what's coming?" I paused, considering her question carefully. "Stay rooted in the truth," I said finally. "Pray, stay connected to him, and don't let fear lead you. The deception will be powerful, but the light is stronger. It always will be." By the end of the evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. These people believed. They weren't just listening, they were ready to act. As I drove home that night, the stars shining brightly in the sky above, I felt a quiet sense of peace. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I wasn't walking this path alone. Over the next few months, more invitations came. Small groups, churches, and even a few conferences reached out, asking me to share my story. With every step, the resistance grew, but so did the support. It wasn't about me. It never had been. It was about the message, about waking people up to the light and the truth. For every person who dismissed me, there was another who thanked me, who told me my words had changed something in them. And that was enough. It was more than enough. As the months stretched into a year, the urgency in my heart only grew stronger. The world around me seemed to mirror the warnings I had been shown during my near-death experience. People were growing more isolated despite the illusion of connection. Convenience was celebrated over discernment, and subtle pressures to conform loomed over every aspect of life. Technology, once a tool for good, seemed to morph into something darker, something pervasive. Everywhere I turned, I saw the seeds of the vision I'd been given. People weren't just dependent on it, they were bound to it. The gradual loss of autonomy, the slow erosion of freedom, was happening before my very eyes, just as he had shown me. One day, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten and shaky. The return address was from a nursing home in a nearby town. Inside was a note from an elderly man named Arthur. "Dear name," it began. "I am 87 years old and I thought I'd seen it all. But after hearing your story, I realized I had been blind to the most important things. Your words brought me back to him. I had turned away years ago, bitter and angry, but now I see. Thank you for reminding me what truly matters." Tears filled my eyes as I read his words. Each time I doubted myself, each time I wondered if I was making a difference, messages like these reminded me of the ripple effect of obedience. It wasn't about convincing everyone or shouting louder than the voices of the world. It was about reaching the ones who were ready to hear, who were looking for the light in a sea of shadows. Still, the cost of this calling was high. My family bore the brunt of the scrutiny and skepticism that followed me. My children came home from school with questions they didn't know how to answer. My wife, steadfast and loving as she was, had moments where I could see the weight of it all in her eyes. One evening, as we sat together on the couch after putting the kids to bed, she turned to me. "Do you ever wish you hadn't seen what you saw?" she asked softly. Her question took me by surprise and I had to think for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not because I don't believe in the truth of it, but because of what it's cost us. I hate seeing you and the kids struggle because of me." She reached for my hand, her grip firm and steady. "We're not struggling because of you. We're standing with you. And if this is the path God has set before us, then I'd rather walk it together than live in comfort without purpose." Her words bolstered me in a way I didn't realize I needed. She was right. This path wasn't easy, but it was the only one I could take, and I wasn't walking it alone. As I continued sharing the message, I began to notice something remarkable. The people who resonated with my story weren't just listeners, they were doers. They started forming their own groups, their own communities rooted in faith and vigilance. They shared their stories, their struggles, and their victories. It was as if a quiet network of light was spreading, person by person, heart by heart. The darkness still loomed, but it wasn't unchecked. The light was pushing back, small but steady, refusing to be extinguished. One day, as I was leaving a speaking event, a man approached me. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by years of hardship. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been lost for a long time, but your story, it brought me back." It reminded me that it's not too late to turn around. I clasped his hand, feeling the strength of his grip. "It's never too late," I told him. "The light is always waiting. You just have to turn toward it." As I drove home that night, the stars shining brightly above me, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the trials or the burdens, but for the privilege of being part of something greater than myself. Each person who turned toward the light was a victory, not for me, but for him. The words Jesus had spoken to me echoed in my mind. "Keep calling them to me. The darkness cannot overcome what I have already claimed." And so I kept going, one step at a time, trusting that the light would continue to guide the way. As time wore on, I began to see the truth of those words more clearly than ever before. The deception that had been warned about, the subtle push toward the mark, it wasn't just something that would happen. It was already happening. It was unfolding in ways that were easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as coincidences or as isolated incidents. But once you saw it, truly saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And once you knew, you couldn't pretend you didn't. I spent more time in prayer, seeking guidance, knowing that the next step I took could be pivotal, not just for me but for everyone who was listening. Every day felt like a battle, a choice between silence and speaking up, between comfort and truth. But in my heart, I knew there was no going back. I had seen what was to come, and it was my responsibility to help prepare those around me. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like a lone voice crying out in a sea of indifference. There were moments when I thought about the world I could have had, quiet, peaceful, free from the scrutiny and fear that came with standing for what I knew to be true. But then, I would remember the faces of those I had spoken to, the letters, the phone calls, the simple but powerful moments of connection that told me I wasn't alone in this fight. There were times when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The world seemed so lost, so consumed by the very things he had warned about. People were blind to the truth, distracted by their own desires, their own comforts, too focused on the fleeting things of this world to see the eternal consequences of their choices. And yet, even in the darkest moments, I felt his presence. It was as though I could hear his voice, not in words but in the quiet whispers of my heart, reminding me of the bigger picture. "It's not about you," he would say. "It's about them. Keep shining, keep calling them." The darkness would never win. I knew that now. The light would always remain, a beacon for those willing to see. No matter how much the world tried to pull them under, no matter how powerful the forces of deception became, the light would endure. It would always be there, waiting for those who were ready to turn toward it. I don't know how much time we have left. The world is changing at a pace that feels impossible to keep up with, and it's hard to know what the future holds. But I do know this: we can no longer afford to be complacent. We can no longer afford to ignore the signs, the warnings, the call to awaken. The time to stand firm in faith is now, before the winds of deception grow too strong, before the mark becomes an unbreakable chain. So I keep going, one day at a time, speaking the truth, no matter the cost. I do it not because I have all the answers, but because I know the light is real. I know that no matter how dark it gets, no matter how loud the lies become, the truth will always shine through. And as long as there are even a few who are willing to listen, who are willing to turn toward the light, I know I'm not alone. We're not alone. We may not know the full picture, but we know this much: the light will never be extinguished. And as long as we have breath in our lungs, as long as we can still see, we must keep calling out. The world needs it now more than ever. So if you're reading this, I ask you, what will you do? Will you keep walking in the light even when the world tells you to turn away? Will you stand firm even when the darkness presses in? I know it's not easy, but I also know it's worth it. The light will guide you home even when the way seems uncertain. Stay vigilant, stay faithful, and never, ever stop calling out to the light.